Okay, it's 3 o'clock. How's everybody doing? Hey, what's up, Kenny? We got Kenny in the front right here. I know a lot of you, I think, some anyway. My name is Alexander Brandon, and before we really get started proper, Tom, right? Yes, okay, thank God I remember people. But, whoa, feedback. Yeah, I mean, there's something special about MAGFest, and I believe there's a tribute of some sort going on this evening, and I know that some of you are probably tired of this by now, but I just have to do it just as a matter of course and tradition. So everybody want to do a Colossus roar with me? Yeah. Okay, so we'll do it on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Yeah! All right, I dig it. Okay. I'm Alexander Brandon, and I write music for games, and there still seems to be a little bit of feedback. Anybody hearing that? Nobody's hearing that? It's just me? Wow. Boy, maybe I've got some tinnitus going on here. So, yeah, I mean, I've been doing this since around 1995, and what this is about is not just, I can go off all day about technical stuff. Okay, I do stuff on the ad-lib, I do stuff, with mods, or I do stuff, or I, arrange stuff for orchestra, or I do whatever it is. There's a lot more to that. So what I'm really curious about is I'm going to do a little bit of the technical stuff, but then I'm going to get into things that I'm a lot more focused on these days. More specifically, over the years, I've become obsessed, or one becomes obsessed with technical aspects of things. Oh, here's what the technology is doing. Here's what the latest console is doing. Here's what is going on with the latest plugins. And what do I need in order to, do I need Cubase? Do I need FL Studio? Do I need Pro Tools? Whatever it is. You can usually find information like that all over Facebook and in a ton of places like Gearsluts and whatnot. Having said that, oh, water. Yes. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that.
Yes. Everybody give this guy a round of applause. Lesson number 1, MAGFest, don't die, hydrate, and that's a lesson in life too. Anyway, so we get technical a lot, and we obsess about what's gonna really make my stuff sound great if I use the right cue with sound tools, or if I use this other thing with Waves plugins, or if I use the right Omnisphere thing. And there's some of that to what it is that we do, but there's a lot of what we do is in what one might call soft skills, like communication, actually reaching out and developing relationships with people, understanding what it is that makes people tick, understanding how to collaborate on different projects. That's really what I want to impart to people in this room, more so than what the right plugin that you need to use, or hey, it was great to be able to use an ad-lib back in 1995. So I'm going to start with just sort of a quick overview. How many of those of you are familiar with this game Tyrion right here? Okay, Tyrion was released in 1995 by what back then was Epic Mega Games, and it had music that sounded a lot like this. And it was cool because you could really customize your ship in a lot of different ways, and there were lots of aspects of the game that could have used specific music that was used for specific things. But we didn't care about that back then. All that mattered really was that we had one song per level, and it was just sort of like all the shooters that came out back in those days, like Thunder Force 3 and Gradius 3 and all of those other shooters. So you would essentially have a piece of music that would last in between 1 minute and 30 seconds and 2 minutes per level, and that would be it. That's all that really mattered, was just getting those melodies to fit in those spaces and being able to use the tech, which back then was the ad-lib and the Sound Blaster. How many people are familiar with ad-lib and Sound Blaster technology, sound cards? Okay, at least we got some of that going on. So this is essentially where things began, and the real challenges had nothing to do with reaching out to people except in one aspect. Right? So this game did not look like this when it originally came out. It actually looked pretty crappy. I wish I had a YouTube sample of the way it used to look. But we used a lot of programmer art and things that we did ourselves in order to create these little tiny sprites. And eventually this guy came along named Daniel Cook, who was introduced to us by Robert Allen. These names aren't nearly as important as the process, right? So don't worry if you don't remember, or you can ask me later. Robert Allen was our producer at Epic, and the way that we actually connected with Epic was we got a demo together, and we were like, okay, where does it go? We knew of 3 companies that we were interested in sending this to: Apogee, Epic, and Origin. Origin at the time made the games that we were just nuts about, like Wing Commander and Ultima and a bunch of PC games and RPGs and other shooters that Chris Roberts made. How many people here are familiar with Star Citizen? Okay, so he's still making games, infamous though they are, and so like back then he was making Wing Commander. We were going nuts about it, and so what we were looking at was like, oh, how do we get in touch with Origin? How do we reach out to the people at Origin? And Epic and Apogee. Well, Epic and Apogee, at the end of all of their shareware games, Apogee made games like Major Striker and the original Duke Nukem games. Actually, eventually, yeah, through 3D Realms, they published Duke Nukem 3D. And I believe that John St. John is attending this this show, by the way. So make sure if you can meet him. You got the voice of Duke Nukem walking around here. But anyway, so like we go to Apogee with the address that's printed. Like after you finish every shareware game, you hit enter, and then it's are you sure you want to go? Okay, yes. And then they've got an address that's just sitting there. It's a mailing address. So it's like, okay, we will send our demo to this mailing address. So we included our emails because back then we were using CompuServe emails. Dating myself. And so the same was true of Epic. And so we did Epic, and Origin was a little tougher, but there were little manuals, and you could send stuff from there. We didn't hear anything back at all from Origin, right? Nothing. We heard back from both Epic and Apogee because we had this demo that didn't look nearly this good, but this guy, his name was Cliff Blazinski, took a look at what we did and said, hey, this is like Xanac for the Nintendo. I really think it's cool because they respond and they get like worse and worse as you power up more, and that's really cool. Like that's different. That's not just waves of enemies that are exactly the same. And so we kind of prided ourselves on that, but again, the look really wasn't there. So Cliff convinced Tim, who was the president of Epic, to hook us up with Robert Allen, and Robert Allen found us this artist, Daniel Cook, who is in charge of what's the name of the company? They do Steambirds Alliance. Anybody play Steambirds? So whatever the name of the company is that does Steambirds, he's running it right now, and they do fantastic work. If you haven't checked out Steambirds, definitely check it out. So Daniel Cook did the artwork for us and blew everybody away. It became a full Epic release, and that is how we actually managed to start in the area of professional game development, right? So one might think, how am I supposed to do that now? There's way too much of this. There's too much competition. I don't, there's no way that I stand a chance against it. There have been panels at places like the Game Developers Conference about something called imposter syndrome. How many people are aware of imposter syndrome? Oh my God, this is great. Okay, so imposter syndrome, for those that don't know, is all the things that I mentioned about becoming really intimidated by most of all yourself. Oh, I might not be able to do this. I don't think I can do that. I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough is the chant of the people with imposter syndrome. You actually are good enough. Maybe you're not the right fit for this specific thing here for like doing all of the rest of the Assassin's Creed soundtracks, right? Maybe you're not the exact right fit for doing the next Battlefront. Maybe it's going to be Gordy Hobb from here in perpetuity, right? He's damn good at what he does, don't get me wrong. Having said that, you are really good at what you actually do, that you really focus on and you really put your time into. It might not work in that moment in time. It might not work for that moment in person. But don't say I'm not good enough, okay? So that getting past that is actually the key to actually at least starting down the path that you want to start as a creative. How many people here want to be a composer for games? Okay, there's quite a few people. I see Mr. Gerard Marino is up here. He's done a few games you might have heard of, like God of War and quite a few other things. DC Universe Online is another big hit of his. So yeah, he goes through the same shit that everybody else here does. Is this going to be good enough? Is this right enough? Am I putting as much as I possibly can into it? Is this going to just blow people's socks off, right? So that's a worry that absolutely everybody has, whether you're starting, whether you're still doing it, right? I'm not doing AAA games. I haven't done a AAA game in quite some time, and it's not because I don't think I'm good enough. I branched out into sound design and voiceover. Opportunities come along that enable me to do sound design and voiceover. Sometimes I'm like, oh crap, I'm not, we don't have enough to pay bills this month. What the hell am I going to do? Again, a lot of people have these issues. So like, there's so much shared panic and frustration and anxiety that we all have. In fact, I think there's even some sort of mental health room that's here at MAGFest this year, which is freaking amazing, by the way, that we're actually acknowledging that exists. So get over that hurdle. Like, start with like, okay, all right, I am good enough. All right. So that's like, that's step one. I'm going to transition back into a couple technical things here. How many people here? I'm sorry. You might be able to see the Excalibur tab. I just got that on Amazon out of one of my gift cards. Anybody see that? The original Excalibur film? Oh my gosh. With like, it's so overacted. It's got Nigel Terry and Patrick Stewart and a bunch of other people. And this guy, when the swords first hold up, Merlin goes, "Behold, the sword of power, Excalibur, forged when the world was young, and bird and beast and flower were one with man, and death was but a dream." If you think that's funny, watch the movie. Thank you. So this is Unreal, and Unreal is, we were already with Epic, right? And we noticed that this really cool engine was being made, like, because Doom had already been out, and I think Quake was on the heels of it. It wasn't quite out, but we were seeing screenshots of it in Next Generation magazine. We were going, "Oh shit, this is like full 3D. It's not just Wolfenstein 3D. It's not, you know, it's not Doom, which is still not full 3D, right? Like it's like whatever the term is for being able to go up and down, but not necessarily look or go and have all these polys absolutely everywhere where you could actually look everywhere." So Unreal was being developed in order to combat Quake, to compete with Quake, and we saw that this was being developed at Epic. Myself and Michiel van den Bos, who at the time had made the soundtrack to Age of Wonders, which they're still doing games at Triumph Studios, the Age of Wonders series. If you haven't checked those out, definitely check them out. And that was actually an opportunity. I'm not going to lie. That was an opportunity where we were in Tim's office, and we would see this amazing stuff that he's working on, and we're like right there, but we didn't know if music was being made for it. And Michiel was there with me, and I said, "Michiel, this looks awesome. Let's go into Tim's office and say we want to do the soundtrack." I have to admit, I haven't been quite that bold in so many occasions where those opportunities, those situations have been the same. But that actually happened at that point. We went in, said we want to do the soundtrack, and he said, "Okay, that's it." That was it. We didn't write a letter and go, "Oh, please, can we demo for you? Can we try these parts with the right minor thirds? Can we, use, these alternating instruments that shows that we're the Austin Wintories and Jason Graves of this world that do crazy stuff, and therefore that must be what makes it unique in order to really make it sell. It's not just a generic orchestra or whatever." That didn't matter. It was going to be mods, and the stuff that we did, they thought sounded cool. And we're like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So, So we got onto the project. The initial contract for it was this info is on my fan page. If you look for Alexander Brandon fan page on Facebook, there's a it's not. Yeah, I was going to say no commentary, please, but no, that's actually in the game. Let's go to Vortex. The initial inspiration for this was really a bunch of Roger Dean and Rodney Matthews books. Anybody familiar with those artists? Those are people that did covers for like Yes and Asia. Anybody seen like those really fantasy 70s? Yeah, okay, so you kind of get the idea of what I'm talking about. So there were art books in Tim's office. We're going to get the music from this as much as the sound design. Come on, turn it up. That's all. You know what? Screw it. Let's just play the music. Hold on. I mean, the visuals of the game are very important. Don't get me wrong. Back then, people were looking at this and going, "Wow!" And of course, somebody's put it on YouTube, so there it is. And it's black. Weird. Okay, black. And the answer is none. None more black. This was fun. Hi. Okay, so, oh, thank you. I can point to that now and go, okay, that's like your average wavetable, Korg synth, hold the notes down patch. Actually, admittedly, I had actually not heard the WaveStation samples at that point, but they were available as individual files that you could drag into a mod and then randomize and do a bunch of stuff like we did right there. And the fades of the, the synth pads with like the high stuff, right? Like, we got inspired by Rodney Matthews and Roger Dean. We're like, okay, this is sort of sci-fi fantasy, right? Like, what would sci-fi fantasy sound like? And we didn't agonize over it. We just went with what we thought would sound appropriate to a new-ish type environment, which is sci-fi. It had combinations of both. And the funny part about that is that at the time, people really hadn't heard anything like that before. People were like, oh, let's do like crazy guitar stuff for Quake. Let's get Trent Reznor. Let's have like, his style like for this. Let's get orchestras in Total Annihilation. Let's, Jeremy Soule was like starting his meteoric rise, and doing, like along the lines of the amazing dynamic orchestral stuff he would do and stuff like Skyrim and that whole series. But this stood out. It was just sort of like, oh, this fits with the environment, and yeah, it's got this synth stuff, and you can point to other things to it, but like, it still was stuff that people were like, yeah, I can't really, compare it to other stuff per se. And I will be the first to say, I haven't really been able to quite do this since. Like, I just finished Aven Colony. It was a strategy game, and it has orchestral music in it and synthesized stuff, but it still has a degree of genericism. I'll raise my hand and say, like, I listen to it, and I'm just like, yeah, it still derives a little bit from this other place. So, so magic moments like this happen not just for me, for you guys, right? You're going to have your Unreal moment. You don't know when it's going to hit. You don't necessarily know why it's going to happen. Maybe you're going to just wake up in the middle of the night and go downstairs and fire up whatever it is you're going to fire up. You're going to pull out whatever instrument you think is going to do the job, and it's going to happen. And yeah, it may never happen again, but it will definitely happen. So that's sort of the combo of technical whatever and for Unreal. As far as like the connections thing, continuing along with that, at first, and this is just a little info that might be helpful, Epic at the time was all about royalties for every one of its developers. It's amazing. Nobody does this shit anymore, but like you have like a contract that we were given that said, hey, we'll give you 2%. No, it was 4. At first it was 4. And about halfway through development, GT Interactive Software and a bunch of other publishers were like, we really want to be able to publish this game. We think it's going to be great, and we're going to give you a whole bunch of money. So James Schmaltz and Tim Sweeney called me up and said, hey, you know that 4% royalty we gave you? Can we not you're not doing sounds or anything like that. You're just doing the score. So how about 2.5 instead, right? Because they could see the writing on the wall, and 4% actually would have been quite a bit. I did actually end up agreeing to the 2, and part of their argument was, well, Cliff, he's the lead designer of the game, and he's getting 7. So I mean, like, that's the design of the whole game. So like 2.5 is still really, really generous, and it really, really was generous. That deal has not actually happened since then. And as a matter of fact, at one point, I made a really stupid mistake that if you don't have to make this mistake, don't. I owed some taxes one year where I didn't do the quarterly payments as a independent contractor. Anybody here familiar with being an independent contractor and paying quarterly? Okay, great. When you're an independent contractor, if you can do quarterly estimates, do the friggin' quarterly estimates and send in your tax money. Because at the end of the year, you get hit really hard with like a big number, and you're just like, oh crap, I don't have that money in the bank, so I somehow owe them, and I got to take out a personal loan or do something weird. So in this case, I went back to Epic and I said, hey, can I buy out the rest of my contract and get like $5,000 because I really need to pay this off? And Tim was like, yeah, sure, no problem. Since then, this game has been bundled with I don't know what and has been able to get I don't know how much as far as like all that stuff goes. So it's just like, if you can keep a royalty contract, definitely keep a royalty contract, because that is steady money. It is not, hey, we're going to pay you a standard rate for whatever your work is, and that's going to be it. And you're going to go to the next project and the next one. So, little lesson as far as that goes. And so essentially at this point, things with Epic were coming to an end after Unreal and Unreal 2, which went to Legend Entertainment. And the music, specifically, as far as like how it was integrated, was a little different, obviously, than something like Tyrion. What we needed to do was they were saying, hey, make it dynamic, make it respond to what the player is doing. And I was like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. I just want to be able to hum my stuff and like hold my tape recorder up to the arcade and like listen to the tracks and do all that cool stuff. But they were pushing me in the direction of like, hey, we want it to respond to what the player is actually doing. And that's, even back then, it wasn't as easy to figure out as one might think. We were talking about area-based music, and the first argument that Tim gave me was just like, wait a minute, if we have it change, even if it's a quick crossfade, what if the player just goes back and forth across that same boundary line where like the music needs to change and they keep making something weird take place? And I was like, that's a good point. Well, maybe like we have some behavior that's coded in where you have to wait a certain period of time until the music has to change back, or we have the way we change it isn't location based. So it turns out that we didn't make it location based. We made it based on combat. We made it based on exploration. So we have exploration, combat, and then when you die, we have a death theme. So that evolved into from that point, Deus Ex. Which Unreal 2 took place, which I wasn't actually able to write any score for. Let's say long by yes. I know. No commentary. Oh, really? Oh, cool. I like Ross. Doesn't he talk with sort of a low voice and say, da, da, da. Yeah, no, he does good stuff. No, not Mankind Divided. Oh my gosh. Actually, the best walkthrough of Deus Ex, if anyone is at all interested, is Bobbin Threadbare. If you're familiar with that guy, what? Yeah, he not only talks about the game and the little hints as to where things might be. At the end of each segment of gameplay, he goes into the story in depth and says, "Oh, you want to know about the Illuminati? Well, here's the real history behind what the Illuminati is. Here's the social ramifications of what the Illuminati might be doing if it were in the position to do what it did then, today, et cetera, et cetera." And it's fascinating stuff. So, so definitely check that out. Let me think about how. Oh, I already did that. Yeah, let's do this. Realistic difficulty? Wow.
Your appointment to FEMA should be finalized within the week. I've already discussed the matter with the senator.
Yes, Bob.
I take it he was agreeable.
And it's misbehaving
again. He didn't really have a choice.
Has he been infected?
Oh, yes.
Has anybody here seen the Machina version of the intro to Deus Ex? Yes. Get the hell out of here, Denton. Anyway, so I'm trying to think in terms of like actual helpful info, like how did I initially... Oh, yeah. So you've done Unreal Tournament. Obviously, if you have significant projects under your belt, that should mean that other projects should just come to you, right? Nah. Don't really work like that. In the case of Deus Ex, was already a massive fan of System Shock and Warren Spector and all the projects that he's done, and I sent a demo of Straylight Productions, which was myself, Dan Gardape, Andrew Sega. We had done music for Unreal together. Dan and Andy had done music for Crusader, No Remorse by Origin, and they essentially, we formed Straylight. So we sent a demo off to Warren Spector, and he actually responded and said, "I love the sound of this music, and I love that you want to do, to help us out." I didn't know they were working on Deus Ex, but they said, "We got this project, and it looks like on your resume you've got Unreal experience. So will you help us out?" And I was like, "Yes, absolutely." So that's how Deus Ex started, and yes, it was just that easy back then. And God knows, I know it's a little harder because there's a lot more people vying for the same opportunities these days. You never know when just sending a message out with, "I like your project." Not, "I'm a composer and I do great music." I like your project. I love Assassin's Creed. I love Call of Duty. I love Halo. I love whatever it is that you guys are interested in. Expressing a specific interest and showing that you've actually paid attention to whatever it is that the person that you're interested in doing, saying, "Hey, I love your project. I want to be able to work with you, and here's some ideas that I have," stands a lot better chance of even getting a response than, "Here, check out my demo. Here's a handkerchief with initials on it." I actually did get a package in the mail that had a handkerchief as a gimmick. It was very strange. Now, that happened to be an incredibly nice composer who I did later meet at a GDC, and it turns out he's working on a lot more stuff these days. What? There.
My orders are to stay here.
So that as far as relationships and being able to reach out, that's the little lesson to be had from Deus Ex. Just send a demo, got a response. Yes, maybe it was insanely lucky, but maybe it was the fact that we had worked on Unreal and not many people were working on Unreal games at that point. But I ended up working on the project. I collaborated again with Michiel van den Bos and Dan Gardape on this, and the actual integration of this. We didn't actually work in the game engines at all at this point, by the way. All we did was we submitted mod files, and the team would actually integrate them into the game, but they had to follow a certain format. Like, for example, right here, you've got conversation mode. So every mod file had to have a series of patterns, pattern sets. So how many people are here familiar with Amiga mods and mod formats and that sort of thing? All right. So this was not as simple as writing music on sheet music or notation paper or staff paper. This was essentially getting into a tool called a tracker and actually writing notes along a sort of step time composition format, which essentially, each tick is represented visually and it's vertical, and you put the notes in, and yeah, they line up and they quantize automatically, and it's great. But it can be a little confusing because if you want to apply things like vibrato or anything else, there's this effect column which uses hexadecimal commands, which kind of freaks people out. But when you get the hang of it, it actually gets really quick and easy and fun. But in order to organize a song, there's on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a pattern set. Your left. There'd be a pattern set that would start with the number of the pattern that you would be on. Maybe it's 4 bars, maybe it's 8 bars, depends on the speed that you set. And you have to set like a certain number of these patterns to represent each segment of music. So this would be conversation, there would be exploration, just like there would be in Unreal, and there would also be action. So and death, and in some cases there would have to be a transition for when there'd be like a little cinematic, for example. So, so the same creative technique to writing the music took place in Deus Ex just like it did in Unreal. I used similar sort of, okay, let's make this just a mishmash of, we might use guitars here. Guitars were a little rarer than they were in the original Unreal. Oh, and in Unreal Tournament. I skipped over that one, I'm sorry. I'm going to be performing the UT theme tomorrow night. I think I should mention Unreal Tournament. Having said that, so yeah, so in Deus Ex, you have with the conversations and the other aspects of the game, the way that we approached the actual style of the music was a little more electronic and a little more orchestral. So I took samples from the Peter Seidlacek library, which was on CD, which you'd have to rip into SoundForge and then create the samples and utilize the samples in the mod files. Oh my God, the patience that I had for stuff.
What's the first move?
And so we applied more orchestral techniques and other aspects, but we also didn't care nearly about the level of cohesiveness that you see in scores today. Scores usually are very just dynamically, and in other aspects they flow so well, whereas when you're dealing with the tech of mods, things would cut all the time. You would have situations where you would have music that wasn't even mastered, because you couldn't master a mod file per se because it's being played as a file. All of these things that are being done in scores today really weren't happening back then, so all we had to do was just sort of make sure that the overall volume setting within the mod file was roughly equivalent to whatever the other
they bring you back to New York.
So essentially, Deus Ex turned into the phenomenon that it was because you could choose the style of gameplay that you wanted. And as such, that's why we had to have the idea that exploration would be very ambient and would be very subtle in nature, and action would be really in your face and nuts when you decided that you wanted to start blowing people's heads off or making explosions. Or when you're in conversation mode, it needs to be sort of middle of the road, something that has a little bit of intrigue, a little bit more rhythmic aspect to it. So that's essentially where that came into play. After Deus Ex, I wasn't so much composing for games. I was doing audio direction for games. I was working with Midway. I was working with Obsidian. With Midway, they couldn't have been more opposite. Like Midway would like, hey, let's do a Gauntlet game, and that would be just a big cluster. Oh, let's do a Rampage game, and that would just be nuts in its own way. And hey, what's up, Skitch? Sorry, Michael Skitchiano, great composer in his own right, like many of you. Having said that, Midway was just insane, and what it was a lesson in was people. There are people in the business world that don't really care about games that run game companies. Yeah, it's kind of true, and those people can come across and actually be incredibly ruthless and assholey and really horrible human beings. And they're just like, "What? I'm not going to pay you that. Fuck that. Oh well, what's the profit on this? Where's the explosions?" Like, if you can picture a caricature of like a game executive that has like a cigar in their mouth and be like, "Hey, what's going on here? Where's the money?" I mean, those people, it's not far off from reality, especially at a place like Midway. Midway has a legacy that all of us just go nuts for, with stuff like Pac-Man, which they admittedly brought over from Japan, but games like Rampage and MP8 Jam and Gauntlet and all of that stuff. Like, we love those games. This company gave us quite a few hours of fun. But man, some of the people that work there, especially at the end, is just like, what in the hell? So yeah, I mean, the lesson there at this stage for me, as like whether it's a composer or a professional, is if you choose to butt heads with people over principle, right? You know, just like this guy's being a douche or an ass or a chauvinist or, you know, all of the above, which I've definitely seen quite a bit of. You can choose to say, okay, I'm putting my foot down and I don't like the way you're doing this and whatever. And yeah, you'll probably get let go. And that's just, that hopefully that's going to change. I really hope it does. We're seeing some movement along those lines right now. It's not enough, but especially back then in the mid or late 90s, early 2000s, it was rampant all over the place, and people thought if they thought they could get away with it, they tried to get away with it. Or you try to keep your head down and you try to be creative and just do what you can. And that's essentially what I did for as long as I could. But yeah, Midway turned out the way it did. Well, eventually an opportunity came along that was Obsidian. Somebody that I had worked with there was at Midway. Went to Obsidian and said, hey, you want to come with us? And I was just like, you know what? Yeah. Obsidian was a little nicer. It didn't have the corporate stockholder. You know, we got to answer to the stockholders. We got to put this game out and only spend this much money. I did have a couple producers come into my office and say, there is no audio budget for this project, so you can't say that you're working on it. But here's what we need you to do. I was still getting a salary. Just for some reason, they couldn't report that whatever was going on in my department was getting charged to that game. Somehow I had to figure out to make it, you know, come from someplace else. That was the kind of stuff that happened all the time. And yeah, it drains your soul. And it's good to have the experience there. But the more I experience things like that, the more it is important at the right point, provided you've got a way to pay your bills, at least in some way, to be able to say, okay, what you're saying is crap. It doesn't make any sense. I see maybe you're coming from this direction of, I need to save my project and here's how I'm going to do it by not saying that I'm going to include audio. But, if I have, if it's wrong, let's start there and let's like move forward. Like, if you really think something is actually wrong, just be like, I think this is wrong. This is why. This is why I think that it is. Because there is a ton of status quo, all over, not just the industry. It's all over Hollywood. It's all over film and television. And yes, you can deal with it and put your head down, But if there is an opportunity to be able to say, sorry, yeah, I don't agree with that. And here's why is also an important aspect of that. So Obsidian, moving on to Obsidian, I'm not necessarily going to skip over Midway because Midway was the first orchestral project I got to do, thanks to Mr. Inan Zur, who has worked on the Fallout games, and he's a super great guy, super hardworking. And he was just like, we've got to get an orchestra into this project. It's going to make it so great. And we'll do this stuff in Seattle, and I know the guy there that can help you do that. And it's not as expensive as you might think. And sure enough, it wasn't. So I pitched it. It managed to go to the Seattle Northwest Sinfonia. It was a lot of fun. There wasn't much interactivity or response with the music itself, but it was just because it was an orchestra, right? That's the sort of, I wouldn't call it a trap, but it's easy to look at an orchestra as the thing that will automatically make your music sound amazingly good. Let's not make that assumption. Orchestras, yes, have this grandeur that we all grow up with, like whether it's Star Wars or anything along those lines, and they pull the heartstrings, and they can still do that. And obviously, they're still used quite a bit. But don't let that be the only part of your toolbox, or don't think that that's going to be the answer to trying to make something more emotional, more dynamic, more impressive, more thick, whatever it is that you think might work. Doesn't necessarily mean an orchestra is going to solve your problems. It's great to be able to use them. But there's plenty of times in which I've seen, well, let's use an orchestra or let's use a chamber bit here. Let's try to figure out how we can use a section there. And you can, with the things like Spitfire and the other modern libraries that are out today, you can, I guess it's called prevising, the equivalent of like, oh, this is what it might sound like, but yes, it'll be even better because you have that much more texture to the instruments because they're being played live, etc. But you can take these libraries, whether it's, even the old East-West stuff can still do some amazing things these days. I'm still using it in conjunction with some of the newer stuff. And you can make, so you can put this stuff forward and you can say, let's see if only this many instruments would work here, or that many instruments would work there, and really see, like where live is really gonna make the stuff that you're working on shine. Or, let's, maybe something else would work. Maybe something else would be good. And so, yeah, live is great to use like at least a little bit in every project you have. Like there's, whether it's just picking up a guitar and playing it yourself into whatever it is that you're doing, or in the case of John Robert Matz playing the trumpet, here he is going, no, don't point me out. So yeah, it's pretty much whatever you can do in order to add something that one live instrument can make something that's otherwise synthesized just sound as though like the whole thing's live, unbelievably. Anyway, so I kind of went off on a rant there. We're at 3:37. I'm going to give myself literally 3 minutes before I open it up to Q&A here. So let's go to Obsidian, and then that leads into freelancing. But what was that? Mask of the Betrayer. Oh yeah, Alpha Protocol. How many people here played Alpha Protocol? It's a great game. It just let's see, main title. I'll give you the story behind this one. Alpha Protocol was at this point where we... Oh my gosh, really? Title sound? Oh, here we go. The main theme was written by BT. Anybody familiar with him? Okay, yeah. So... Oh, please. Are we hearing anything? Is this it? No? It's playing at a lower sample rate. 10 hours of Alpha Protocol. Played at 8 kilohertz, right? And 4-bit. How cool would that be? It was oh my gosh, 5 to 38. My first troll, ladies and gentlemen. I did that, yes. I've always wanted to, actually. Anyway, that does remind me, as a quick anecdote, there was somebody that told me a story. I think it was Jack Wall. He's done work on Call of Duty and a number of other games. Brilliant composer, great guy, saying that he worked with Peter Gabriel at one point, and that Gabriel was saying, yeah, we're going to write like this. We're going to write a 20-minute song, and it's going to have like 200 tracks in it, and then we're going to like compress it all down to stereo and then use it as a sample. I was just like, okay. Like, make an instrument with an entire 20-minute song, like, compressed down to like, so that's kind of nuts. Anyway, so the Alpha Protocol theme was written by BT. This was a point where, yeah, it's just like you got, asking about value and like what's really going to make your game shine. I honestly think that any game composer, BT was great to work with. He's fantastic to work with. There was a couple of areas where he was like, no, I'm not going to change that just because I think it sounds cool. And if he, and so he's creatively, he sticks to his guns, whether or not it's part of the direction or not. Sometimes that's good, sometimes, yeah. But I really think that most of the colleagues that I have in the industry could write a theme of that equivalency for about 1/50th of what we actually paid BT. Because BT is BT, like he puts on these amazingly cool shows and writes this awesome stuff like This Binary Universe, and again, he's really nice guy, great to work with, but we paid him a lot, and so I'm thinking, there was another option that took place before we had BT of a guy that crap, I don't even remember his name, but he was at a company. Gerard, what's the name of the place that is run by Hans Zimmer? Remote Control. Back then it was Media Ventures. Okay, yeah. So this was a guy that worked at Media Ventures, and he had provided some stuff for Pirates of the Caribbean 3 or something like that. And we were listening to his demo, and we were like, this sounds really, really cool. Again, there's plenty of game composers that probably could do a pretty good job or equivalent job of this same guy. But we were listening to his demo, and we thought it sounded really good. We had him by, and we talked to him, and we were ready to hire him. The reason we didn't hire him is because his agency sent us a contract that said, here's all the additional stipulations about mechanical publishing and all this other stuff that needs to be included that he retains ownership to. Writer's share is something that you guys, who's familiar with writer's share? All right. So writer's share is essentially like by default, I'm pretty sure it's 50%. Is it 50%? by default, 50% of something that is representative of the composition, not the recording that appears in whatever it is that, like the movie or the game or whatever, but the composition, the writer retains 50% ownership of that. That's called writer share. Writer share was in there. We couldn't sign it. Obsidian could not sign that. The reason for that is because Obsidian had a contract with Sega. And Sega, their contract with Obsidian said that you do not have rights transfer. So Obsidian could not, on Sega's behalf, say, oh yeah, here's 50% writer share. Didn't have the power to do that. And the agency wasn't really budging. And the agent put me in touch with the agency's lawyer. And I was just like, okay, whatever. And on the phone, this guy said, music is above the line. Everything else is below the line. This was just as I was trying to explain the whole rights transfer aspect. Yeah, I see Sebastian laughing this stuff over there. Yes, that is an actual term that's in Hollywood. And what that essentially, and I talked to the agent, and she's like, oh, you didn't really know what that means. Sorry, this is exactly one of those things that you look at and you go, okay, I think that's wrong, and here's why. Right? You don't just say it's above the line and below the line. Oh, you don't speak our language. That's why it came across as a, fuck you. Sorry, but yeah, that's kind of how it came across. It came across as that you're saying your composer is better than everything else. That's kind of how I interpreted it. So what that essentially means is that there are above the line aspects to a contract that and the line represents aspects of ownership or something that isn't more important. It just means it has a slightly higher consideration for the success of the project and the considerations for ownership, et cetera, et cetera. So we let that guy, we stopped talking to that guy. We didn't continue talking. And BT didn't care about above the line, below the line. He was a record industry guy, and he was just like, yeah, I want to work on your project. I'll do your title name. So, okay, we're coming up on 15 minutes until the 0 hour. There's a lot more that I could impart, but what I really wanted to do, again, was share some of the biz dealings that I've had, share some of the discussions that I've had with people, share the relationships, the fact that you are good enough. Please, God, you're good enough at what you do. And send me something which I might not respond to as far as demonstrations and stuff that you've done in the past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when I actually do write critiques, I write constructive criticism, and then I say, okay, here's how this can be interpreted. Here's the use of acoustic XYZ. Here's dynamics. Here's, methods that might or might not make your thing more unique. The challenge for everybody in this room, all the way up to Mr. Williams himself, is how do we make our stuff stand out? How do we make it, whether it's a theme that uses a traditional orchestra, whether it is the latest crazy stuff that Spitfire comes out with, and you see a magazine ad that just has a wave in it, and you're like, what the fuck, Spitfire? What are you doing? I don't get it. Is this an instrument? I don't get it. They do that, by the way. You're just so. But they release a lot of strange libraries, right? And people latch onto them, and they say, this is what's going to make me unique and really, really cool. Not necessarily. It could be a combination. It could be the Omnisphere 1.0. Tweaked crazy is going to be the thing that people point to and go, that's the next Undertale. And they didn't even use 8-bit stuff. It's really, really cool. It's really unique, and it really is emotional, and it's awesome. So that's a challenge all of us are facing every day. And I think that's the one to focus on the most, as opposed to, does it have to sound like does it have to sound like an orchestra, or does it have to sound like a synth, or do I need guitars, or do I not need guitars? Start with something that really fires you up. And take some tiptoes outside of that arena and see where it goes. And that's a way that you can at least start the process of oh, this is kind of interesting, and also if it actually fits the game that you're on, and if you happen to get inspiration. Again, Unreal became the unique aspect that it did because we were looking at the game in these art books by Roger D. and Roddy Matthews. It was that which derived us combining the instruments together the way we did. That's all I got for now until Q&A. I want people to be able to ask questions. So who's got questions? I'm going to repeat them because I don't think we have a mic here. One back there. Okay, feedback. The question was, what kind of management tools are used for feedback, for garnering feedback from game directors and producers, as well as being able to communicate and also get, communicate that stuff to the people that are actually doing the work, the contractors, the producers, the composers. So a lot of producers and directors will have very wide sweeping, I don't want any guitars in my game. I don't want any friggin' synthesizers in my game. At first, as a meek young composer, I'd just be like, okay, no problem. Now, as an audio director, or even if I was to get a job as a composer for something, I would say like, oh, okay, and as a matter of fact, check out who wrote the latest Doom. Mick Gordon. Check out Mick Gordon's GDC talk. It's really informative as far as, getting stuff that like at first they were like, no guitars. And he was like, now hold on a second. Let me send you something that doesn't necessarily sound like we're just throwing Pantera into your game. Like let's actually experiment and do a sound design approach for guitars and actually really make a unique, but still, what is Doom? It's fucking guitars, right? Come on. Like, if Bobby Prince was here, he'd be just rolling his eyes and going like, you dumbasses. So, make sure that the toolbox is open. That's what I do with game directors. And I also, I don't necessarily explain it to them like that. I say just like, well, it's important to keep an open mind. And if we want like a particular style, we concept it, right? Like the thing that we have to do is we use reference stuff from other things. We come up with examples that are just bits and pieces of what really will establish the signature, because we've got to at least pinpoint a few foundational stylistic foundations for the project and be able to say, okay, let's at least draw on these to establish some form of cohesiveness. I myself am so eclectic, I usually keep those to a minimum, because sometimes something will come along that really diversifies and goes all the way out in left field that sounds fucking amazing later on in the game or even early on in the game. And so that even keeping your mind open, even past those initial foundations, communicating that to the composers is done by providing the reference material, by being able to say, oh, well, we chose you because X, Y, Z, and you use these techniques really well, and we'd like you to use that. And sometimes it's a journey that everybody takes together, and you're all exploring at the same time, which sometimes can be the most fun. You're just like, I don't know if you can do reggae. Let's give it a go, And sometimes people will nail it, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. I've known composers that have been working since they were 15 in 1982 that aren't necessarily nailing the right sound after a year or so on a particular project, but it happens. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question. Any advice on getting what? Getting stuff to loop well. The technique that I typically use for looping is I'll have it starting on a strong transient of some sort. It could be, a big hit that's like timpani but you were going to say something else. Oh, yeah. Transitions. Transitions usually really help. And it could be something as simple as a cymbal swell, or it could be something that actually takes a particular specific piece and uses the exact same instrumentation and the chord progressions or the modulation or the chord that it's on at that particular moment. And then you say, okay, where I need to go from A to E. Okay, the transition, I'm going to write like a 5-second transition or however many measures you need. And you write it for that, and you write it going into something else that's specific. I've known games that have used a ton of specific transitional material just so that you can get from one point to another. And there's tools like Wise, mainly Wise, that really uses transitions pretty well in order to get from point A to point B. And in some other cases, I'm not going to call it the lazy way, because sometimes it might work really well, like a really decent crossfade in between one and the other. And of course, it all depends. I'm sorry, I just got the 10-minute warning. Yes, 10 minutes left. Okay. Yes. Oh, you got to ask me an easy question, right? The question is, how do you get music from your head, out? Yeah. Excuse me. So let me clarify that a little bit. You're saying that you can hear it in here. For me personally, what I do when I can't quite break down what I've got going on is I do what I do when I practice, and I slow it down. I slow it to 0.1 if I can in my head, and I go, wait a minute, okay. And I it takes a lot of concentration. Concentrate on exactly what, just and I also break it down into parts. Like whatever the part is that might be the most melodic one will usually get the first bit of attention. Slow it down, and then I put it down. And then I'll move to like the next part. And if that doesn't work, I'll at least be able to tweak it outside so that I can at least, see. And it can take hours of tweaking before it actually comes to fruition. But, slowing it down and stemming it, so to speak, really, really helps. Hope that helps you. I see the cherry blossoms on the wall. Somebody's probably already written that, right? I don't know. Thanks. I'm sorry, really, really quick. How many people here know about Stephen Slate? Okay, Stephen Slate he comes off as this complete tool, but like look him up on YouTube. He's actually incredibly smart. He's got some really cool gear, but he introduced the VMS, virtual microphone system, right? So that you don't have to spend a ton of money on these really expensive mics. You spend like $1,000 or something like that, and you get 2 mics that emulate really well, like Neumann's and all that sort of thing. And at the beginning of that, you see him like he's got like, I don't know, he's got like a leather jacket on and these rings, and he's just like, River, what you doing to me? And I'm just like, oh my God, seriously? Oh, jeez. Anyway, and through a classic British Class A mic preamp. Yeah, you got to check it out. And anyway, so I just reminded myself of that. So brain fart. How do you? How do you know that what you've done has been done before? I mean, you know that you've heard it before? So you're positive that you've heard it before, and it's definitely something else. All right. So take the stuff that you've been writing, change the intervals across the board, and see, like, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't, I mean, I go a fifth here, but I went like a minor third down instead, or a second, or whatever, and it's not quite what I had, but it's not the same. So that's a first technique of at least being able to take something that you have in your head that you don't want to just completely lose, right? And you want some aspect of it that really speaks to you personally, and you're able to change it subtly here and there in order to make it. Because if there's, I mean, seriously, the next thing that I write, I've had this thought. It's just like, most likely this has been done somewhere by somebody, because there really is only a limited palette of unless we're going microtones and all that crazy sound design shit, which I'll do that sometimes and whatever. That doesn't necessarily do the same thing as a melodic and harmonic piece. So yeah, give a shot to just doing some minor tweaks to stuff that you write down. As far as I'm sorry, Gerard. Oh God. Oh man. Just for everybody, what the question was is like, what do I wish that people in position of project direction management, in whether they're indie or large, would do more of, presumably before a soundtrack needs to be written, and or even during the process. People they do not consult with like what the needs of a project are. Usually what ends up happening is they say, oh, here's how much music cost on the last project, so let's use that as a starting point for this project. That's not the best idea without asking questions of people that are in the know and have the information about, like, what union players in Czechoslovakia would be playing at that particular time, or like what kind of rates people are charging over the last 3 years, because a big project will easily take that long. So more consideration for budget and time. in terms of just like at least asking the questions early on and saying, what is it that we need? And if, you know, the people that they ask say, well, this is our best guess, and they have to stick to that best guess, then yes. That's what all the pros that get asked, whether it's a composer, whether it's like somebody representing union players, or somebody, you know, like that's doing the orchestrations, all of that kind of stuff. Like those people need to give the answers that they're going to sort of hang their hat on for that particular project. But the directors can't make those kinds of assumptions. Another thing is, as like I said, ties back into earlier, keeping the toolbox open and not making the assumption that, oh, we need this style of music. We need to, oh, the music supervisor is going to be drawing along, you know, these particular pop acts, and that's going to represent, you know, the entirety of Tiger Woods' 2003 golf. God bless Steve Schnurr. I actually mean that, because he hired BT at one point and said, well, I mean, he kind of did, he did a horrible thing and an amazing thing. Like the horrible thing was like getting, I don't know, an alternative band and a bunch of them to like do like Tiger Woods the previous year. And then the next year he hired BT to do a custom score and said, I want you to create the sound of golf. And it was actually pretty fucking good. It sounded awesome. It was like, it had some electronic and acoustic aspects to it. And it was cool. So anyway, so the second part is better than obviously the first part, but there's not to say that the licensed tracks, anybody play SSX Tricky? It's kind of old now, but oh my gosh, the techniques they used with licensed tracks were great on that. They took them, they somehow managed to get the rights to be able to break them down a little bit and get stemmed versions of what they could, and use dynamics in order to actually make them like explode back in when you land, and, you know, and behave dynamically and interactively that way. So that was awesome. So yeah, those things mainly, just being able to say like, okay, the game is going to need the music to do this at any one particular point, so therefore we're going to need to have iteration. We're going to need the game code, and we're going to need the tools that we use in order to be able to accommodate that. We're going to need to be able to understand that that's going to be necessary based on whatever it is the game we're making. We're going to need to budget properly. We're going to need to schedule properly. Oh, I'm being told I have to wrap it up. So I guess that's our last question. Thanks, everybody.